What if I told you that after 15th century, just a single word shaped and justified centuries of genocide, looting and cultural annihilation? And it is responsible for the changed demography of the planet Earth. You heard it correctly, just one word. Sounds impossible, right? But that is the truth, and that is the power of false narrative. That one word is savage. At first, it sounds like a simple and almost a harmless word. One would use it today to describe a wild act or a fierce person, but its history is anything but harmless. In early medieval Europe, savage simply described something wild, untamed or uncultivated. It was then applied to wild animals, rugged land and people who lived outside organized society. But by the end of the medieval era in 15th century, with the rise of church as a strong political entity, that was when the word was weaponized at its peak. For centuries before Europe set sail, the Islamic empires had expanded under the banner of Dar al-Islam.
In Islam, there's a concept called Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. That means the house of Islam and the house of war. Anything that's under the Islamic control is good. Anything that's yet to be under Islamic control is under the house of war.
Branding others as kafir, also called as non-believers in Christianity, whose lands and lives could be rightfully taken as per the commands of their Abrahamic gods. After a problematic stretch of Islam colonization till 14th century and then the long Christian crusades against it, the power shifted. By the 15th century, Europe had not only pushed back Islam in Spain but also turned outward, carrying its own theology of conquest. The church took the same logic. Those outside Christendom were savages, just as they had been called kafir once. The same playbook was now modified to become even more deadly. What began as a war of religions now became a global project. Conquest baptized as virtue, erasure of civilization reframed as God's will, and eventually rebranded as civilizing mission of empires. Its first targets were actually their own. Polytheists like the Celts and the Vikings were hunted, converted or enslaved under this label. Then popes began dividing the world into two: the land of Christians and the land of non-Christians. Non-Christians weren't just outsiders anymore, they were savages. Papal bulls like the Doctrine of Discovery and the Treaty of Tordesillas gave divine sanction to the new wave, declaring entire continents open for plunder and loot. In the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, the Pope literally drew a line across the globe and said, Spain gets this half, Portugal gets this half. The people already living there didn't count. They weren't nations to them. They were just savages. That papal decree gave European empire a divine license to plunder the planet. During the 15th and 16th centuries, as European powers began to explore and colonize the word savage became a tool for dehumanization. And if you are branded a savage, you could be conquered, enslaved and erased without any remorse or guilt. The term was systematically used to describe indigenous, tribal and nomadic people in the newly discovered lands. By labeling these populations as savage, colonialists created an ideological justification for conquering and seizing their land, exploiting their resources, butchering native people and forcing their conversion to Christianity. It was the narrative around the word savage which now worked as a legal cover for genocide in the Americas, for the slave trade in Africa and for the colonization in Asia. It turned human beings with their own civilizations, philosophies and sciences into animal-like subhumans in European size. One word, yes, just the single word became the moral alibi for Europeans for mass slaughter and theft. By the end of 16th century, the word had traveled everywhere overseas. Indigenous Americans, Africans and Indian all declared savages in the church-sanctioned hierarchy. Now the word had become a moral weapon for the European Christian world. A Christian could kill them and call it holy, loot their land and call it righteous, erase their cultures and call it virtuous, conquer and enslave them and call it God's work. When more ships followed after Columbus landed in the Americas, savage was a ready-made propaganda. Native Americans were all branded as savages Their deaths were justified, their land stolen, their culture erased or rewritten. In Africa, all native tribes were savages, ripe for the slave trade and exploitation. Millions were shipped in chains, millions died even before reaching the slave markets. And in India, resistance was branded as fanaticism of savages. Ancient traditions were mocked as superstition, great knowledge systems were dismissed as primitive, highly developed civilization was called backward, while these colonizers looted wealth, starved natives, and dismantled civilizations that were thousands of years old. The pattern was clear and repeatable. First kill them with the guns and cannons, then label them with the words and tags, then write the history books calling them all savages in need of civilization. No invading army in the history comes close to the sheer scale of the death and plunder as unleashed by these colonial empires. In America, when Columbus arrived in 1492, at that time approx 10 million natives lived north of Mexico. By 1900, fewer than 250,000 remained. Over 90% were killed by smallpox, starvation, massacres, butchering of animals on which natives depended. Anything and everything was used to wipe out the natives. But in their storybooks, the savages were being civilized. In Africa, cities like Timbuktu had universities and libraries. Native empires had thriving trade routes, but Europeans arrived with chains. 12 to 15 million Africans were shipped as slaves like some cargo.
Competition between ships has resulted in an increase in prices. Therefore, we shall only take 286 slaves out of the 300 we initially wanted.
2 million died on the ships alone, and many more were killed in their own lands. In Congo alone, King Leopold's rubber empire killed over 10 million. Obviously, Indian situation was even worse. By the time Britain left, $65 trillion wealth was stolen. They engineered deaths during their rule way more sophisticatedly than even the Nazis could. 1770 Bengal famine, 10 million gone. 1783 Chalisa famine, another 11 million gone. 1791 Dojibara famine, 11 million more. 1830s to 1870s Guntur, Agra, Odisha, Rajputana, each famine claimed hundreds of thousands to over 1 million lives. 1876 to 78, the Great Famine, between 5.6 to 10 million starved while grains were shamelessly stolen and exported. 1896 to 1900, two more famines back to back wiped out 5 to 6 million. Then in 1943, Bengal famine, 6 to 10 million dead, even as Churchill's government again looted and exported the rice to Europe.
রাস্তাঘাটে স্কুল থেকে আসার সময় আমাদের মতো ছোট ছোট বাচ্চা আমরা দেখতাম মানুষ মরে পড়ে আছে। এটা যে কত স্যাড, কত কি, শেষে বাইরে যেতাম না আমরা ভয়, রেশন কার্ড।
And famines weren't the only killing fields. 1919 Jallianwala Bagh massacre, hundreds were gunned down within minutes, perhaps over 1,000. In post-Jallianwala crackdown, massacres were done across Punjab, Gujranwala, Kasur, Amritsar's countrysides. Villages were bombed and burned. It was the first time in world history when rulers bombed their own subjects. Countless smaller massacres went unrecorded because the British buried their own crime. So if we stack it all together, over 70 million Indians were starved and killed under British-made famines. Adding the massacres, the engineered poverty, the systematic dismantling of industries, and the toll might rise to even 100 million. If this is not the biggest crime in human history, I don't know what is. And have no doubts, this wasn't mismanagement, it was policy. And whenever Indians fought back, the British records called them savage fanatics and terrorists. Here again, the word twisted the roles. The thieves became civilized, the defenders became savage. Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, China, Korea, Indonesia, South Africa, and the list goes on and on and on. There was a saying in that era which said, "The pale man's greed is more powerful than any god that you pray to." It was this greed that led to millions and millions dying without any sign of remorse or guilt. So it's time we ask ourselves and redefine who the real savages were. Was it the people defending their homes, or the ones who were burning forests, enslaving people and killing millions, stealing their generational wealth and erasing entire cultures while lecturing the world on morality and humanity? The word shadow still hasn't left us. Even today, we are called developing nations, and those who built their countries on loot and plunder proudly call themselves developed. Our sciences are still dismissed as myths while they keep stealing and repackaging it into European inventions. The weapon changed shape, but it never vanished. But the only good news is that cracks are forming, native voices are rising again in the Americas, African scholars are reclaiming their history, Indians are rewriting theirs, not as tales of defeat but as centuries of resistance, and our biggest strength is that the truth is on our side. The fact that we are still here speaking these truths means their monopoly on the story is finally ending. So the next time you hear savage in a classroom, book or a documentary, pause and ask yourself, who wrote this? Who benefited from this lie? Because Native Americans, Africans, Indians, Aboriginals, Asians, they weren't the savage. They were the civilizations of art, science, philosophy, love, peace and spirit. The ones who plundered, enslaved and erased them in the name of their hateful, angry God, they were the real savages, and why we must keep looking out, because their ideological heirs are still living in the world and justifying the Islamic and Christian colonialism to this day. So we must open our eyes and see it for what it was. As once you start seeing the things the way they are, you will never see the history the same way again.